Welcome, welcome. All right, over to you, Phil.
Okay, good evening, one and all, and welcome to this webinar in the wake of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. You're all extraordinarily welcome. My name is Phil Glendenning, and for the next couple of months, I'm the director of the Edmund Rice Centre based in Sydney, and after February 1, the Alopi Latukepu, who is online, will be in this chair. So Alopi, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us. To everybody else, thank you very much, and you're all welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the fact that we are gathering in Australia, certainly on the lands of traditional peoples, and of course the Pacific, we recognise First Nations peoples as well. I'm sitting here on the lands of the Garigal, on the shores of the Hawkesbury River, and I'd like everybody, in acknowledgement of that situation, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. So just to remind people, if you could mute yourself, thank you. And yeah, so wherever part of Australia or the Pacific you're on, we acknowledge the First Nations people of this region of the earth. We acknowledge we come in peace. And in this country, we acknowledge the elders past, present, and those soon to emerge. So, so you're all very welcome. Just a couple of thank yous before we start. I'd like to particularly thank the Brigidine sisters, the Good Samaritan sisters, the Presentation sisters, Amnesty International, who have funded our delegation to the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was made up of 5 Pacific Island delegates, including our own Maria Simon from the Edmund Rice Centre, and 2 Torres Strait Islanders who attended COP27 as part of our delegation. So Pabai, Paul, Vina, Anna, Maria, you're all very welcome. We thank you for your representation for the centre and for all of us at COP27. A couple of housekeeping details, just to again remind you, if you could keep yourself muted, and of course, very importantly, if you could turn your camera off if you don't want others to see you. And we have occasionally had our fingers burnt a bit in the past when people have forgotten to turn off their cameras. So
I'm just going to put our 3 names there.
Okay, and if you, again, I ask if you could kindly just mute yourself if you're not speaking. So look, this for the last, let me think, the last 15 years, the Edmund Rice Centre has been sending delegations to the various COPs, usually and most often in partnership with our friends in the Pacific, and often with delegates made up of emerging youth leaders, particularly from Kiribati and Tuvalu, and also Fiji. And so this particular COP, led by Mahendra, Maria, Mina, and Anna, I think we thank you for your representation, and long may this continue. Now, hosting us tonight and chairing the session is Corinne Fagaray, who is our inaugural PCP coordinator at the Edmund Rice Centre, and I'll hand over into her excellent hands to take us further. Corinne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and welcome to everyone. In the registrations, we had quite a few people joining us from the Pacific. So if you are joining us from the Pacific, and indeed, if you have been to COP yourself, like I can see Simon's online as well, and perhaps others who've just come back from Egypt, I just want to encourage you to partake in the conversation as well. We decided to hold this as a meeting, in meeting format rather than webinar format, because tonight is going to be an informal talanoa, which is the Pacific word for an exchange, a dialogue. And so we want to make it informal and comfortable for people to, ask questions, and comment, etc. The format of tonight will be about 20 to 25 minutes of listening to our guests who have just come back from COP27. So they'll have about 4 or 5 minutes each to tell us about their experience of COP27, what marked them most about this COP compared to other COPs, the top 2 or 3 most productive outcomes and the top 2 or 3 most disappointing outcomes of this COP, and where they feel the Pacific and Australia might need to go from here. So we're at the end of the year, so we're looking, certainly in terms of PCP and the Edmund Rice Centre, we're looking at next year now, and this will be really valuable insight for our planning in terms of climate advocacy. So I'm looking forward to hearing them. The next half an hour after the speeches are over will be for questions and answers. So I would encourage you to write your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping track and moderating a question and answer session in the second half of this meeting. We will end at 7 p.m. sharply. So I'd like, first of all, to introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Dr. Mahendra Kumar. Dr. Kumar has a distinguished record of working on climate-related issues and is currently honorary associate professor at the ANU. And Dr. Kumar also provides support to the Pacific Elders Voice. And for those who don't yet know the Pacific Elders Voice, it's an emerging group that's been around for about 12 months of former Pacific leaders, high-profile leaders that provide insight and views on a range of Pacific-related issues, including climate change. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Damien Spruce. Dr. Spruce actually joins us from Egypt. He's been taking a little trip down the Nile, which is lovely, after COP. And Dr. Spruce is the Advocacy Associate Director for Caritas Australia. And I've been following him on Twitter during COP, and he's been incredibly active around Pacific climate advocacy, which is why we asked him to come today. Miss Maria Simon Chi-Fang, many of you will be familiar with Maria, who is, of course, our Edmund Rice Centre Pacific Outreach Officer, has been to many COPs and has been in her role for over 10 years now. So she'll have some really interesting insights to provide us in relation to the representation of Pacific Islander issues at COP, which I think has really, really evolved in the last few years. I don't know whether Mina is with us. Mina, are you there? All right,
I'll try him again, Corinne.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening with Mina, but he may join us later. And Anna, are you here? So Anna is a climate activist from Kiribati, and she has just returned to Kiribati from COP27. And I know from experience that it is sometimes incredibly difficult to have good internet reception from Kiribati. So it's possible that she's having issues with that. Talking about internet reception, I think I might actually welcome Damien to start first, because he's got good reception now, and I'm just wary that might change, given he's in a little bit of a precarious situation there in an Egyptian cafe. So I'll let you start first, Damien, and tell us about your experience. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Corinne, and thanks to everybody. So we went as I went as a representative of Caritas Australia, but also of Caritas Oceania, the Caritas organisations around the Pacific, and our priorities. Talking to our Pacific allies and partners, what they had asked us to look at in the months leading up there was climate finance and people's the lack of local communities' access to the sort of resources they needed to do the adaptation work on their islands to make it safe and habitable during climate change. And so we did a lot of work. We produced a report, the Twin Clouds report, looking at ways of getting greater access to the $100 billion in climate finance a year that was available, and so we took that report to COP. We also went with we went across to Kioa in Fiji to have a talanoa with Pacific civil society before COP and produced the Kiowa Declaration, which sets out the main priorities for Pacific civil society around COP. And so we took those two documents to COP, and they provided a good entry point into discussions and advocacy at COP. We spent a lot of time at the Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion, where the Kiowa Declaration was launched with the Pacific Climate Warriors, with Mahendra, with Joseph Sekulu, and a whole bunch of Pacific advocates and activists. And we worked, we did as much as we could to support them as they in their I guess, strategic goals that included influencing the Australian government, putting a lot of the issues from the Kiowa Declaration on the agenda of the negotiations. A lot of the wording from the Kiowa Declaration ended up being used by Pacific government negotiators in their actual position. So it was copied into the Fijian position, it was copied into the Tuvaluan position. And it was a great, there was a great momentum and push from Pacific civil society into those discussions that the Pacific governments were having. We also, I mean, the other big thing for us at COP was using our the global Caritas networks and the global sort of Catholic networks to advance the interests of the Pacific civil society, also of Caritas Africa and African civil society. At COP, there was a lot of push in the Caritas networks for the Coronivia joint work on agriculture. So that's a lot of work on food systems, food security, and getting that incorporated into the UN climate change mechanism. So food security, food systems start to be looked at through a climate change lens. So we worked through that. It was the first time that the Holy See had a delegation at the COP as a fully signed up party to the Paris Agreement, and we worked closely with them on getting some of the priorities of the Pacific, like loss and damage, and fossil fuel reductions into the statements of the Holy See and into the priorities that the Holy See was seeking when it had. When it was in negotiations with other governments, and that included things like we were invited to a meeting with John Kerry's advisors on climate change there, and negotiating to make sure that we had 3 Pacific representatives at that meeting to give those advisors for the Special Presidential Envoy on Climate a better understanding of what was happening on the ground where climate change was hitting, and why loss and damage, the sort of loss and damage people were experiencing, and why they needed to move and address that area. Sorry, Corinne, is that enough to start with, or yeah?
Sorry, I'm muted. Yes. Thanks, Damien, for opening the speeches. And Mahendra, do you want to go next?
Yeah, if you insist, Corinne. Yes, thank you, and thank Edmund Rice Center for your support for my participation. You obviously paid for my travel, and I also thank the Marshallese government for giving me the country badge, which allowed me to actually oscillate and be part of both the negotiations as well as all the civil society activities, which I think I was in a very enviable position where I could pick and choose, and therefore I did not immerse myself completely in negotiations, because once you do that, then you are not able to participate in the rich discussions which were being held by civil society and many other groups. So the remarkable thing about this particular COP, and I might add, and as you are all aware, this COP was held in the backdrop of course COVID and Ukraine crisis, and they're important because clearly the Ukraine crisis in particular, and also the COVID crisis, also sprung new demands on countries, and the COVID and the Ukraine crisis in particular for energy, and the way countries would be able to provide support and deal with the energy transition. As far as I could see, this particular COP was interesting in the sense that it delved into a whole range of issues, including development, finance, technology, human rights, indigenous issues, gender, and so on. I mean, to this end, there were hundreds of side events and thousands of public discourses and discussions. And I think, as Damien has said, the discussions and some of the advocacies by the civil society groups played no small role in terms of influencing some of the discussions in the negotiations. Now, so I think the role of civil society, youth groups, various indigenous platforms, and so on, should really be applauded and encouraged, I think, even further. I'm convinced that without the advocacy, for example, on loss and damage, we may not have even gotten that result which the COP was able to achieve in the final hours of the negotiations. Back to the actual COP, as we all know, the Pacific in particular, but developing countries in general, have a few ambitions and hopes. The Egyptian presidency wanted this to be an implementation COP, and indeed we all wanted it to be a COP which will try and enforce ambition as well as implementation, and the ambition centered around the fact that 1.5 degrees temperature goal needs to be reflected and needs to be stressed and emphasized, really, because it is really for the salvation and survival of many Pacific countries. And to that end, finance was extremely important, both for mitigation and adaptation. And I think the Pacific countries were caught up. They have been very, very active in the mitigation lead up to Paris, where obviously they demanded or wanted the big polluting nations to show the way in terms of emission strategies, much more ambitious NDCs, by how much they can reduce emissions, and so on. And one of the key demands in relation to finance was that of loss and damage. As we all know, this is really the unavoidable impacts of climate change, which cannot be addressed through normal adaptation. And the loss and damage issue included both economic and non-economic losses, such as biodiversity, culture, and so on. So there were, in terms of the actual outcomes, I mean, you must have all heard the COP, went into, it didn't end until very early Sunday morning, and really, I think we must salute our negotiators. A very exhausting time for everybody, and I suppose one of the highlights was the fact that the loss and damage facility was agreed to. Now, I'm saying that with a little bit of I guess hope, optimism, a note of optimism, also perhaps some sort of legacy for the current host of the COP, because in relation to that, the loss and damage facility is established, and that's what many of the Pacific countries wanted. Now, how it will work, how it will be funded, by who and by how much, it still will be subject to discussions, and I'm afraid that might take years. Certainly not in a year or two. It is something which probably could take even 4 or 5 years, even longer, because from the current experiences of finance, we can't be too optimistic. As we all know, the UNFCCC, the COP had agreed to a $100 billion pledge by 2022, which has yet to be realized. So given that, I mean, there is a little bit of skepticism. The loss and damage fund doesn't even talk about liability. Of course, doesn't talk about compensation. John Kerry from US, right at the outset said, oh, no, we're not going to have compensation. And I think that was the backdrop. And US was the major holdout for these discussions moving forward. I suspect in the end, loss and damage facility was agreed really as a way to get some of the bigger emitters out from greater commitment on the mitigation side, which is very sad, because what it means is there are no major or even reinforcing the Glasgow pledge to speed up reduction or elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and phase out of coal. I mean, that wasn't even reinforced, and therefore the mitigation side of things, I think it looks bad. But the symbolism for the loss and damage fund is quite great, because I think it's an important symbol for climate justice, because that's what many countries were fighting for. Now, going forward, and I'll leave some of the other outcomes and so on to my distinguished colleagues in the panel. I think we can't lose hope. What we must do, I guess, going forward, particularly to 2028, is keep the momentum up. I think whatever shortcomings were in COP27 needs to be fulfilled in COP28. The Pacific have a huge role in terms of putting up pressure on Australia, which is expecting to host COP31. And I think the countries have made it clear that it's not a conditional support. It is a conditional support, so it's not unconditional. Clearly, there has to be a lot of work going forward in terms of what the Pacific want, and I would very much hope that Australia would listen and probably assist in advocating for some of the issues which have so far not really been addressed to everybody's satisfaction. I think the positive, the next host of the COP is United Arab Emirates. It has recently established itself as a significant player in diplomacy generally, and it has good relations with the global South. I think they've also, in spite of being dependent on oil and fossil fuels, it has adopted recently a pragmatic approach to energy transition. So I think we can all hope that they would provide a much more determined and much more visionary leadership going forward. And whatever shortcomings there have been, and there are quite a few from COP27, we would be able to try and address this in the next few years. Thank you. I'll leave it there, Corinne.
Thank you very much, Mahendra. That was fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm sure we're already getting some questions. So I'm sure we'll be digging into some of the issues you've brought up in the second half of the meeting. Maria, welcome, Maria. Maria Tiimon, our Pacific project officer, has been to many COPs. And she said to me when I first spoke to her at COP that this COP was different from any other COP that she's attended in the past. So Maria, over to you to give us your observations.
I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners. I also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal and the Torres Strait elders of other communities who may be here at this event. Firstly, I would like to congratulate our Pacific leaders and everyone who has been so vocal on climate justice. I know and we know that at every COP, people like you have been a massive support in one way or another. I must say, as Corinne said, that COP27 in Egypt is quite different from the COPs I have attended in the past. I've attended like 7 COPs before this, and I must say that I've never seen such a huge number of NGOs and a massive number of youths before, compared with their presence at this COP. To me, the voices of NGOs and the grassroots people, including our leaders, have a great impact on the decision-making process. Some of the key outcomes from COP27, of course, climate finance, especially for loss and damage, is the priority for Pacific Islands. And just to put loss and damage in the discussion is very, very hard. And I remember the day that loss and damage was finally on the agenda, there was a great feeling of joy amongst the Pacific groups and the rest of developing countries, even though it was still critical. But for them, it has been a hard-fought battle in the negotiations, and it took actually about 30 years to get it this far. So to me, for them, it is the beginning. And as we know that last Sunday, 28 November, was a historic day when it was finally announced that the wealthy countries had agreed to have a global fund for loss and damage and to provide financial assistance to developing countries affected by climate change or climate disaster. I personally think that the outcome of COP27 is far from perfect. Well, the wealthy countries are talking about giving financial assistance to developing countries that are suffering from climate change, but they are avoiding talking about phasing down fossil fuels. This is not their priority, which I think it should be. From my own perspective, what is the point of funding loss and damage when you continue to dig fossil fuels? We are still fighting to make 1.5 degrees Celsius stay alive. There is still no ambition to cut down their greenhouse gas emissions. And if Australia is serious about being a good neighbor to the Pacific, Australia needs to take climate action seriously. Wherever their coal and gas are burned, it's affecting every human being, and it's also affecting their neighbors, including the Pacific, where this is about survival. Tuvalu has become the first country to use United Nations climate talks to demand an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which would phase out the use of coal and oil and gas. To me, Australia has a responsibility that goes beyond their shores. Australia needs to stop approving new coal and gas projects. Australia needs to get behind the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to phase out fossil fuels and support a just transition. Where to from here in terms of climate advocacy and climate justice? To me, we still have lots to do. There is a great need to advocate for climate justice and amplify the voices of our Pacific brothers and sisters. Australia is planning to co-host COP31, and Mr. Chris Bowen said, and I quote, COP31 is an opportunity to work closely with our Pacific family, and we will seek to co-host a bid with the Pacific to help elevate the case of the Pacific for more climate action. To conclude, if Australia wants to rebuild their trust from the Pacific, as Chris Bowen has called our Pacific family, then they need to show action, not just words. Kamraba, thank you.
Thanks, Maria. That was great. And finally, I invite Anna. So Anna, thank you for joining us. I know how tenuous the internet connection can be from Kiribati, and I also know that you just landed back in Kiribati this morning. So thanks a lot for making the time. Anna is a climate activist in Kiribati. Anna originally did our Edmund Rice Center Pacific Calling Partnership Climate Leadership program a few years ago. And since then, she has just gone from strength to strength. And it's just so wonderful to see that and to see her speaking at COP side events. Anna is also a gender and youth officer for the Kiribati government, and she's a co-founder of the Toongaru Climate Alliance in Kiribati. Over to you, Anna.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me from there? I'm just trying to find a better place to. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the PCP, Edmund Rice, especially for making it possible for me to attend this COP, COP27. As Corinne said, I've just arrived here in Kiribati, and it is good to be home. What I want to share about the COP is that this is my second COP for your information. And as Maria said, I also believe that this is a different COP with what I have experienced in COP25. As I could feel that there is more unity among the Pacific Islanders. There is a group that is, I think, giving us the strength to talk and to know that there are somebody or someone or a group that is backing us up. And it is an honor to join the invitation from the Pacific Indigenous Women Network, which allows us to work with the Indigenous people. And that's where we are able to share our differences. And even despite the differences of effects of climate change, we still are facing the same issue of climate crisis for our people in our different places. What I really like about this COP, I could feel also that this is also that it's a challenge for me to ask for the patch for the government, knowing that they have their home. But knowing now that our government is working closer to the NGOs, so they managed to offer us a 2 weeks patch, which allows us to get in there. And we are also included in their decision making. It's more for me. I feel that I am more included as a Kiribati Islander, whereas in the beginning with the COP that I attend, it's like I'm just alone. But now I could see that we are working as a team and going and giving our sharing in the COPs. They are always there to back us up. So we believe that there is a strong bond because of fighting for one main important issue for us as Kiribati and Pacific Islanders, fighting for us to be able to survive in our own land and not to leave our motherland, which is so important for us. As I appreciate by my other colleagues as well, one of the most important part of COP this time, despite the fact that they are not even achieving what they have been promising, one of the most important achievement we believe that is also through the contribution from the Pacific Voices is the loss and damage financial mechanism, which we believe this is a one-way step up to be able to hear the voice of the people of the Pacific and to be able to give hand to help our people. And on my way back to Kiribati, I happened to sit with one of the Americans, and he was asking me, "Oh, where have you been?" And I told him that I went to COP. And so he said, "Oh, what's the news about COP?" And I told him, well, one good news is that we're so happy that now they are able to give the financial financial fund for to support all the damages that have been happened through the climate crisis. And then he jumped up and he said, well, yes. And one thing that I'm worried about is that they are happy to give that, but are they willing to give up on their fossil fuels? That is a different issue. And so we were discussing because I was about to talk about it and he jumped up with that. And I said, yes, that is one also issue, and that is a problem. Even though they give us one on the other hand, but they still are using, they are still producing the gas emission, which we believe that is the core issue. And I believe that through the working together with our partners, especially with the Australian government, we believe they will be able to be our voices in bigger nations. And through our collective voice with the different countries in the Pacific, who are mostly at the front line, I believe Australia will be a good partner, will be fighting for us as more brothers and sisters. So he also gave his point of view, which for me is, I find it very interesting to have somebody who is able to be involved as well in COP. And I asked him and he said, no, I wasn't in COP, but I was following all the decisions and the negotiations that have been done through my other friends and through internet. Which for me, I believe that there is step up, and I hope, like for me, yes, I hope, and I told him, yes, this is a first step, which is so.
Anna, we've
and
lost.
I believe by doing this, we'll be able to work on what they have been doing, but through the collective voice. And now we are working on our group as Indigenous people. I believe we will have more stronger voices. Thank you very much, Corinne. And yes, bless us all for this beautiful evening.
Thank you, Anna. I can feel the Pacific atmosphere all around you as you're talking to us. And also, you know, can really sense the sense of solidarity, not only between Pacific Islander nations, but also between, you know, indigenous peoples across the world and between developing countries. And that sounds like it's much stronger than it has been in other COPs. I don't think that Mahendra has actually been able to join us, so I do hope that he's okay. But he has not been able to join us, so we apologize for that. We've got about a half an hour left, and I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and open the floor for questions. And it seems appropriate to open the question and answer session with a question from Mr. Alopi Latukefu, who is the incoming director of the Edmund Rice Centre, and who is joining us today. Alopi, I just wonder whether you'd like to ask your question in person.
Sure, if you like. And can I say what an honor it is to be here, and a pleasure it is to participate in this, even if unofficially. I'd be keen just to hear what the mood of Pacific participants was coming out of the meeting. And were there wins identified, apart from the loss and damage fund for the Pacific, that really stood out for those from the Pacific at the meeting? Thank you.
Thank you and welcome.
Welcome,
yeah. Mahendra, do you want to, or anyone else, do you want to have a go at answering what was the mood of Pacific participants coming out of the meeting, and were there wins identified apart from the loss and damage fund for the Pacific that stood out for the meeting? I just note as well that we've got other Pacific Islanders that are joining us that have gone to COP. So if you are one, please feel free to comment and answer as well.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Alopi, and welcome and congratulations on your new important role. And we look forward to working with you. Well, I must say that apart from the negotiators, you know, were the only ones left on Sunday morning. Of course, very exhausted, and at starting 3 hours notice, they actually had the final plenary, and a lot of the texts still remained open for a very long time. So it has been a very exhausting experience for many of them. So I really, apart from the loss and damage facility, I can't think of any major sort of, any major gains in relation to the core issues. I mean, there obviously were issues, technical issues, which are sorted out in relation to Article 6. This is the carbon markets and so forth. But I think on the major issues, which is to do with the mitigation, the targets, the expectation, the temperature goal. I on balance, I think this, as far as I'm concerned, probably more disappointment. I mean, especially in light of the science. One of the things which the COP could not even do, which was very sad, was endorsed what IPCC reports had already highlighted. So in some ways, I think it really throws into question the whole climate diplomacy and the way it is done. One of the observations which was noted by various commentators was there were more fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP than Pacific Island delegates. And you know, one is not entirely surprised by the pressure they exerted on a lot of the delegations, not just developing countries, but obviously countries which have vested interest in fossil fuels. So we have a way to go in relation to our major demand, which is the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature goal. The UNEP GAP report, which was also produced about the same time, puts us on a track to achieve to get to 2.7 degrees centigrade. So the signs are not entirely comforting. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahendra. Does anyone else want to add? to that? Okay.
I totally agree with Mahendra. It's I guess to me, I wouldn't call it's a win thing with you know, with I don't think Pacific Islands go back with, you know, that feeling of winning. But I think it's just the joy, the feeling of joy, because as I mentioned before, that it took about 30 years to get it this far on loss and damage. And I think we still need to work harder, not just us Pacific Islanders, but the whole developing countries, because as we all know, climate change is affecting everyone. Unfortunately, Pacific small islands like Kiribati and Tuvalu are right at the front. So yeah, I agree with Mahendra, and we still need a lot to do.
Thanks, Maria. It seems appropriate to move on with a question from our current director, who sent me a number of questions, but I thought the one, Phil, that you had about which countries were holding up the process and which countries were supportive of the Pacific. And in particular, how was Australia regarded by the Pacific in terms of its role in loss and damage and other issues?
Could I please invite Simon to share his opinion on this? Please, Simon.
Okay. Please, Simon. Are you there? Or Damien, in fact.
Yeah, while we're waiting for Simon, I might also ask Dylan if he's got any thoughts on this. But look, it was interesting. Chris Bowen came out with a big statement early on that he didn't think that there was going to be much progress on loss and damage, which proved to be entirely wrong. But I think a lot of people there in the Moana Pavilion interpreted that as being a blocking statement. And sort of siding that he'd sided with Joe Biden and the US on this, that the message had come through that the US wasn't very happy about this, and so Australia was also blocking it. You know, in their final statements, Bowen seems to have said, "Oh well, no, I was positive about it all along," and because he was given the role of climate, sort of bringing landing the climate finance part of COP. We thought, oh, maybe that'll make him more open to things. So I think Australia is sort of playing both sides of the field on that one a bit. But and we got sort of conflicting reports about how whether the Australian negotiators had been sort of stopping things in the actual negotiations themselves. But I think that there's a real, Bowen was also saying, with COP31, he seemed to be suggesting that the whole of the Pacific was on side with him on that, without making any concessions. And so I think that, I think there's a real opportunity for like the Vanuatu climate change minister did, to really put a lot of pressure on Australia to really make some much stronger commitments if they expect support for COP31.
Anyone else? Which countries were actually supportive amongst industrialized countries? Were there countries that were supportive of loss and damage?
Yeah, I think EU was very supportive, and there were countries like Switzerland and so on, I think, who were also quietly very supportive. I think as Damien indicated, I mean, John Kerry's initial statement really was proved to be a disastrous backdrop. And initially, I agree with him, and I got the impression that Australia was just sort of kind of hiding behind them and not sort of saying anything. But I personally feel they could and should do much more visibly in terms of assisting. I mean, after all, they're a member of this important group, umbrella group, which has got Japan, US, New Zealand, and so on. I mean, say New Zealand was different. So in terms of not being very prominent and not really, I agree with them, and we couldn't really figure out. But I think part of this, just my thought, Chris Bowen was appointed to co-chair the finance discussions. And because of that, I mean, obviously they took a sort of backstage because you are chairing it and then you are not sort of expressing great opinions. So that might have saved them a little bit. But as Ralph from Vanuatu said, I think that this hosting and yeah, I'm not sure how Bhavan got that optimism. Maybe it's in his discussions with the Pacific leaders, but as we all know, the Pacific leaders are extremely gracious in terms of how they direct, and they wouldn't necessarily sort of say, no, you do this and that at that level. But I think as far as the group I represent, which is the Pacific Elders Voice, I think there is no unconditional support for that hosting. I think we have time, and we'll need to, Pacific will use its position of co-host to make sure that Australia delivers and takes some firm and decisive actions before they are just hosting a pre-COP meeting in a luxury resort in the Pacific is not sufficient to qualify for the co-hosting.
Regarding just a question to push that a bit further, Mahendra, regarding the Vanuatu's foreign minister's statement that Vanuatu won't be supporting a COP co-hosted with the Pacific by Australia unless Australia stops subsidizing new fossil fuels. I think that was what he said. How likely do you think are other Pacific Islander nations to follow?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think this also perhaps calls upon the solidarity of the Pacific Island countries themselves. I mean, I think we do see this as an opportunity, and you might have heard that Samoa has been appointed or elected chair of the IOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, for the next 2 years. After that is Palau. So I'm very hopeful for a decisive climate leadership from Samoa, not just for the Pacific, but also for the entire Alliance of Small Island States. So I think if the Pacific Islands can stick together, I think they could obviously get things out of Australia. But as usual, you'll probably find that there's a lot of bilateral diplomacy. And the fear is that, as usual, with these bilateral arrangements, the bigger Pacific countries would probably be winners, and the smaller ones gets forgotten again.
Yeah. I want to acknowledge on the call tonight, I do have to acknowledge it, Dylan, sorry for putting you on the spot, that we do have Dylan Carver from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network joining us. So Dylan, if you want to say something, please feel free to add as well to our discussion, and thank you for coming and being here. I've got a question from Thea from the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. Thea, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just curious to know, this COP in Egypt was one where there wouldn't have been so many protests and representations of civil society on the streets. And I just wanted to know, did you get a sense that meant there was a bit less pressure from civil society, or was there plenty of pressure from within the COP27 space?
Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I think Dylan might be in a strong position to talk about that, but my impression was that the civil society groups and other groups were extremely forceful and active within the COP space. Of course, they couldn't get their actions out to outside the COP space, which was unfortunate given the draconian laws and so on of Egypt, which had to be sort of respected. But Dylan, he was in the thick of things. So.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendra. Well, everybody, joining you guys all from Suva. In terms of civil society at COP, you would be aware that you usually would have a climate strike at COP Obviously, that didn't happen this year, but what did happen for the very first time was a march through the Blue Zone, which was approved by the UNFCCC. And that had never been done before, but it was very regulated. So it included things like, you couldn't, even in the actions in the Blue Zone, you couldn't name countries, you couldn't finger point, and they were very strict about timing as well. But in terms of pressure, I still think because everyone was aware that civil space was limited, media were more than happy to amplify whatever concerns we had. And we saw that multiple times happen throughout COP, whether it was the human rights issues, whether it was the logistics of COP, which there were many issues with the logistics. These were all amplified. Media was ready at hand to help us amplify our concerns. So there was that angle, the external angle with media, but then also I think what it forced civil society to do was actually work with negotiators. So in the Pacific, what we were doing was, we were meeting with our negotiators, providing them all the support that they needed, ensuring that our messaging on the outside was aligning with what they were pushing on the inside. And I think that tactic really helped add pressure because it made sure that the pressure was sustained from both the inside and the outside, the people working the inside track and the people working the outside track. So it really made us focus on that strategy. I think, but generally in terms of civil society space at COP, it was truly, probably in my opinion, one of the worst. We had many delegates just worried about, had issues with accommodations. In the first few days, it was difficult to find food, it was difficult to find water, and even find toilets throughout the event, throughout the venue. So it was it was pretty difficult. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but it did make doing anything at COP much more difficult. And I did want to highlight, we were talking just earlier about some of the good things that did come out of COP. I think one of the things that hasn't been highlighted yet is the operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage. And I think that's a really important outcome as well from COP, because if you look at the loss and damage finance facility, I know a lot of countries, a lot of frontline vulnerable countries went into COP with that as their priority. And we did come out with a fund, but the financing mechanism has been pushed back. So we don't know the structure, we don't know how it's going to be financed. So we need to see the finance flowing through before we claim it as a win. But as with all things in the Pacific, you also need to take the opportunity to have those small victories, have those small celebrations, because it's really tough to keep the optimism up when you're just constantly bombarded with bad news and blocking. So we do celebrate the loss and damage finance facility, but it's just started. It's an empty bucket at the moment, and we need to see something happen with it to be able to really claim it as a true outcome of this COP. But yeah, I think the loss and damage was definitely a trade-off because there was a lack of ambition in almost all of the other areas. Particularly, and this is one that we were particularly concerned about, was just language around 1.5. We went in saying 1.5 was non-negotiable, but then we saw language watered down, and this was to facilitate the omission of fossil fuel mention, because the message that we were taking to COP was there's no pathway to 1.5 that does not include an immediate phase down or phase out of fossil fuels. And if we can't agree on that, then the 1.5 goal is not reachable. And the fact that we essentially backslid on the 1.5 meant that we backslid on a number of other things. But yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thanks, Dylan. That's incredibly useful and helpful to have your input as well. And from the outside, I have to say that following the COP closely from Australia, it seemed like the Pacific was just so well organized and so well coordinated. The best that I've seen, certainly, and people have said that have been to many, many COPs in the past. So congratulations, because I know you were a big part of that. Congratulations to PCAN. Now that sort of leads us to almost the end of the meeting. I think we could easily spend another hour talking about so many of these issues, but I guess that I want to leave you by asking one more question, which seems like a logical questions to ask at the end of this meeting, and that's to all of our speakers. What recommendations do you have for the climate advocacy sector in Australia in the lead up to the next COP? What should our priorities be in order to support the Pacific? What should our priorities be in the next 12 months? And what should we aim for at the next COP? I know it's a tough one, so take your time to think about it.
Well, let me give it a shot, Corinne. I think I must also sort of acknowledge and thank the groups in Australia, which had supported quite a large number of delegates in various forms. I mean, the Indigenous platform, Kathy Itok and others had done was extremely for us, and so were groups like yours, and of course Caritas, and so on. There have been many, and I think that work really should continue. I think the groups have different strengths. Some, of course, in terms of advocacy.
Oh, Mahendra, are you there?
I think he's dropped out, Corinne.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else want to have a go?
Become more targeted in terms of perhaps getting the Pacific to probably act in terms of Pacific solidarity, the Pacific. So I think that could be done in a way so that it could influence Australia's actions and positions. I think the fossil fuel issue, 1.5 degree temperature goal is key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So continuing to put pressure on the Australian government around, not subsidising new fossil fuel projects and reducing emissions.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes, I think that's vital. I think that's in fact. I mean, Australia's record in terms of its exports of fossil fuels and so on is very well known, and I think Australia could do well to perhaps model itself or set an example to the rest of the world. And I think that is where the Pacific pressure through civil society and government should really be quite a prominent part of the discussions, and should be sort of almost continuous from now till whenever they want to host.
Okay, thanks, Mahendra. Damien, did you want to say something?
I think we should get an advocacy program together leading up to COP31 in the Pacific. I think the locations of COPs are really are really important. I think we've got to go through another fossil fuel based COP next year. So we've got to have a strategy to deal with that and to get more Pacific people on the ground. I think the Kyoto Climate Declaration provides a really good set of goals and priorities to focus on as part of that program.
Thanks, Damien. Dylan, Maria, Anna, or anybody else, did you want to add to that?
I also think that as civil societies, and also I know that there's a lot of NGOs in Australia, throughout Australia. Collectively, we need to work together, and we could do like lobbying and continue to visit our MPs and even the government in Canberra, and put pressure on the Australian government, and also demand a strong action from the government itself before COP next year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Dylan, have you got, or Anna, do you have something specific to say, something specific to add?
Maybe just in terms of what you can do most immediately, there's, just pressure your government to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, or vote yes for the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Human Rights and Climate Change. I think that's the most immediate one, because that vote comes up in December or January. And that's really important, because if we're talking about the failures of the UNFCCC system and this multilateral system in particular, we need to be raising the ambition through other means, and this ICJO campaign is possibly that other means. So yeah, keep the pressure up there. And then also just real quick in terms of, you can help the Pacific amplify their voices. And so every year, what we come together and we put the Pacific Climate Justice Summit to really unify our voices and identify priorities for the Pacific. And so moving forward, into next year, as we go through that process, it'll be great to have, you guys attend this, Australia NGOs attend the Climate Justice Summit, but then also help us amplify that once we get that outcome. I think that's a more tangible one.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. We've got our work cut out for us, that's for sure.
Yeah, Corinne, just one other thing I forgot to add. I think there are other platforms as well Australia is part of, G7 and G20. I mean, some of the language around the 1.5 and mitigation is hardly surprising, given that even G7 were not able to release a unified statement, as you know. So I think perhaps some of this pressure should also be towards G7. India will be chairing G20 or something, I think, and through these sorts of relationships, I think they should be encouraged to be part of the solutions as well. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to all of our speakers today. It's wonderful to, to get your insight. And I know that Maria has said in the chat that today is Anna's birthday. So happy birthday, Anna, and welcome back home. We hope you have a lovely, lovely evening ahead. So much. And as the Edmund Rice Centre Pacific Calling Partnership, we look very much forward to working with the Pacific again next year. And, it's just wonderful to have such a good, productive collaboration with Pacific Island nations, and to be able to support your work and your striving for climate justice. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll be circulating the recording. We actually had about 120 people registered, so there's a few people waiting for that recording as well. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.